Hi. Today we're going to be doing chapter 16. I hope you guys are having a great day. I am. Today is my birthday, and some of my wonderful friends got together and chipped in and got me a couple nights at a hotel. And so I was in the pool earlier, and it's been a great time. So we're going to go ahead and get started with chapter 16, which is called Grave on the Mountains. The path led forward to the edge of a yawning chasm, then stopped dead. This grave-like gorge yawned before them in each direction as far as they could see, completely cutting off all further progress. It was so filled with cloud and mist they could not even see how deep it was down there, nor could they see across to the other side, but spread before them like a great gaping grave, waiting to swallow them up. For a moment, Much Afraid wondered whether this could be the place after all. But as they halted on the edge of the canyon, they could plainly hear the sound of mighty swirling waters, and she realized that they must be standing somewhere near the lip of the great fall, and that this indeed was the place appointed. Looking at her companions, she asked quietly, "What must we do now? Can we jump across to the other side?" "No," they said, "it would be impossible." "What then are we to do?" she asked. "We must leap down into the canyon," came the answer. "Of course," Much Afraid said at once. "I did not realize at first, but that is the thing to do." Then, for the first time on that journey, though she didn't know it at the time, she held out her hands to her two companions that they might help her. By this time, she was so weak and exhausted that instead of taking her hands, they came up close to her and put their hands beneath her arms, so she leaned with her full weight against them. Thus, with suffering and sorrow supporting her, Much Afraid cast herself down into the yawning grave. The place into which they had thrown themselves was deep, and had she been alone, she must have been badly hurt by the fall. However, her two companions were so strong that the jump did not seem to harm them at all, and they bore her so easily between them and broke the fall so gently that she was no more than bruised and shaken. Then, because the canyon was so filled with mist and cloud that nothing was visible, they began to feel their way slowly forward and saw looming up before them a flat oblong rock. On reaching it, they found it to be some kind of stone altar with the indistinct figure of someone standing beside it. "This is the place," said Much Afraid quietly. This is where I am to make my offering." She went up to the altar and knelt down. "My lord," she said softly through the mist, "will you come to me now and help me to make my burnt offering as you have commanded me?" And for the first time on all that journey, there seemed to be no answer. No answer at all. The shepherd did not come. She knelt there, quite alone in the cold, clammy mist, beside the desolate altar in the valley of shadow, and into her mind came the words which bitterness had flung at her long before she walked the shores of loneliness. "Sooner or later, when he gets you up on those wild places in the mountains, he'll put you on some sort of cross and abandon you to it." It seemed that, in a way, Bitterness had been right, thought Much Afraid to herself, only he had been too ignorant to know, and she too foolish at the time to understand that in all the world, only one thing really mattered: to do the will of the one she followed and loved, no matter what it involved or cost. Strangely enough, as she knelt there by the altar, seemingly abandoned at the last tremendous crisis, there was no sign or sound of the presence of her enemies. The grave up on the mountains is at the very edge of the high places and beyond the reach of pride, bitterness, resentment, and self-pity, yes, and fear too. As though she were in another world altogether, for they can never cast themselves down that grave. She knelt there feeling neither despair nor hope. She knew now, without a shadow of doubt, there would be no angel to call from heaven to say that the sacrifice need not be made. And this knowledge caused her neither dread nor shrinking. She felt nothing but great stillness, in which only one desire remained: to do that which he had told her, simply because he asked it of her. The cold, dull desolation which had filled her heart in the cave was gone completely. One flame burned there steadily, the flame of consecrated desire to do his will. Everything else had died down and fallen to ashes. After she had waited for a little, and still he had not come, she put out her hand and with one final effort of failing strength, grasped the natural human love and desire that had been growing in her heart and struggled to tear them out. At the first touch, it was tough. Anguish pierced through her every nerve and fiber, and she knew with a pang almost of despair that the roots had wound and twined and thrust themselves into every part of her being. Though she put forth all her remaining strength in the most desperate effort to wrench them out, not a single rootlet stirred. For the first time, she felt something akin to fear and panic. She was not able to do what he had asked of her. Having reached the altar at last, she was powerless to obey. Turning to those who had been her guides and helpers all the way up the mountains, she asked for their help and for them to do what she could not do for herself, to tear this plant out of her heart. And for the first time, suffering and sorrow shook their heads. "We have done all that we can for you," they answered, "but this we cannot do." At that, the indistinct figure behind the altar stepped forward and said quietly, "I am the priest of this altar. I will take it out of your heart if you wish." Much Afraid turned toward him instantly. "Oh, thank you," she said. "I beg you to do so." He came and stood beside her, his form indistinct and blurred by the mist, and then she continued entreatingly, "I am a very great coward. I am afraid that the pain may cause me to try to resist you. Will you bind me to the altar in some way so that I cannot move? I would not like to be found struggling while the will of my Lord is being done." There was a complete silence in the cloud-filled canyon for a moment or two, and then the priest answered, "It is well said. I will bind you to the altar." And then he bound her hand and foot. When he had finished, Much Afraid lifted her face toward the high places, which were quite invisible, and spoke quietly through the mist. "My lord, Behold me, here I am, in the place thou didst send me, doing the thing you did tell me to do. For where you die, will I die, and there will I be buried. And the Lord do so to me, and much more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Ruth 1:17. Still there was silence, a silence as of the grave. For indeed, she was in the grave of her own hopes, and still without the promised Hinds' feet, still outside the high places, with even the promise to be laid down on the altar. This was the place to which the long, heartbreaking journey had led her. Yet just once more before she laid it down on the altar, Much Afraid repeated the glorious promise that had been the cause of her starting for the high places in the first place. The Lord God is my strength, and he will make my feet like hinds' feet, and he will make me to walk upon mine high places, to the chief singer on my stringed instruments. Habakkuk 3:19. The priest put forth a hand of steel right into her heart. There was a sound of rending and tearing, and the human love, with all its myriad rootlets and fibers, came forth. He held it for a moment and then said, yes, it was ripe for removal. The time had come. There is not a rootlet torn or missing. When he had said this, he cast it down on the altar and spread his hands above it. There came a flash of fire which seemed to rend the altar, and after that nothing but ashes remained, either of the love itself which had been so deeply planted in her heart, or of the suffering and sorrow which had been her companions on that long, strange journey. A sense of utter, overwhelming rest and peace engulfed Much Afraid. At last, the offering had been made, and there was nothing left to be done. When the priest had unbound her, she leaned forward over the ashes on the altar and said with complete thanksgiving, "It is finished." And utterly exhausted, she fell asleep. And that is the chapter for today. I hope you have a great day. Thank you.